John was a skilled mechanic and a committed Marine, so it wasn't surprising that he volunteered to serve in Indochina in March 1967. He discussed his plans with his wife Sandra, who he'd been married to for 3 years. They had a small house and were planning to start a family. Sandra worked as a legal assistant, and with both their salaries, they were financially stable with good savings for emergencies. Sandra cried but understood John's strong sense of duty. He was strong and muscular and known as a tough fighter. Marrying his high school sweetheart had calmed him down. He could still fight if necessary, they said, but they still said goodbye and spent a passionate night together before he left. She said, "You better come back in one piece and stay away from other women. You're mine, only mine," with a playful but firm tone. He replied, "Don't worry, darling. I'll take care of myself. You behave while I'm away. I know how those wealthy lawyers can be. No problem, darling. I promise to be good before leaving." He also updated his will and set up automatic payments from his military salary to cover the mortgage. John got a tattoo that read, "Death before dishonor in Vietnam." He was a fire team leader, and people were initially skeptical about hiring him as a reservist. However, he proved himself and gained respect after several combat engagements. Unlike many Marines, he avoided local women and remained faithful to his wife Sandra. Despite teasing from Corporal Harker, he was warned about rumors that circulated about men whose wives were left behind while they were deployed. However, John had complete trust in Sandra. He wrote to her as often as he could and kept her letters safe. He got letters every 2 weeks at first, but after a few months they became less frequent. He thought this was strange, especially when he started getting more letters from his parents, and even photos of Sandra in a swimsuit he'd never seen before. He wondered who had taken them. That Christmas he got a card and a letter from his parents, but nothing from Sandra. He was still focused and concerned, but he remained vigilant in Vietnam in mid-January 1968. When he was stationed near Dang, there were rumors that the enemy, Charlie, was planning a major attack around the Lunar New Year's Day at the end of the month saw chaos erupt and John's position come under heavy attack. They fought back with everything they had, but most of John's team, including Harker, were killed. John was injured, and he and the other Marines were evacuated to Da Nang and then to a military hospital in San Francisco. The doctor saved his leg in San Francisco, but he had a long recovery ahead of him. The bullet missed vital organs, and the stitches fixed his cheek. His ear was bandaged, and the nurses said the scar made him look distinguished, but he wasn't sure. John's time in Vietnam was over, but he was back in the Navy. The officer awarded him a Purple Heart and told him that he was being recommended for a Silver Star. John already had a Bronze Star with a Combat V and a Navy Commendation Medal. John's parents met him in San Francisco. He wondered where Sandra was and if she knew he was back in the U.S. His father, a veteran, joked, "Son, I thought I taught you to duck." His mother hugged him tightly and cried. "Where's Sandra?" J.N. asked. His parents exchanged glances before responding, "We don't know." His father finally said, "We tried calling the house. I went to her office, but they kept saying she wasn't there and she never returned my calls. I haven't seen her in weeks. I stopped by the house every weekend to take care of the yard and check in, but nothing." I told John that the last time I saw Sandra was about 2.5 months ago. I was driving up the street toward your house and I saw a guy leaving. He got into a sports car, I think it was a Corvette, and sped off. I saw Sandra at the door in a robe waving goodbye to him. She said she didn't. I didn't say anything when I arrived. I haven't seen her since then. I've been picking up the newspapers and your mail when I pass by. I'm sorry, son." J.N. was devastated. He had believed she would be faithful. Then he remembered what Harker had said about wives and began to wonder if John was right. He understood why he hadn't heard from her. "Was it a blue Corvette?" John asked. Bob nodded. "Yes, it was," John replied. "It belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her firm. So she's not even around to pick up the mail." Bob said, "I hope you don't mind, but I saw a couple of utility bills in your name, marked this final notice. I took care of them. I figured you wouldn't want to come back to a house without electricity or phone service." John said, "I'll pay you back when I'm on my feet. Don't worry about it, son. Just focus on getting better. Don't stress about this until you're ready. If you want, I can look into getting power of attorney. If she's not managing the bills, who knows what else she might have done. We don't know what's going on with her. It could have left you in a tricky situation financially." J.N. asked for help in finding a military lawyer, and soon a Navy lieutenant commander arrived and took notes while J.N. and his parents explained the situation. He pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "I'll prepare these documents for you, Corporal." John said that after the lawyer left, Bob turned to his son. "John, I'll check the bank to see what's going on. I still have the house key you gave me, so I'll stop by and check things out. You know George Williams? He retired from the police force a couple of months ago and now works as a private investigator. I can ask him to look into this if you want." John said that after 13 years on the force, he'd be happy to talk to their family lawyer. He said that, by the way, Bob's job at the shop is still waiting for him. Wilkins has been saving a quarter of Bob's salary since he left as a welcome bonus. He said that he wasn't going to let the best mechanic in the state slip away, but he didn't want Bob to tell him that John felt grateful. Wilkins was a generous man, but he didn't show it often. He was fair and honest with customers, but he had a tough exterior that could be intimidating. "That sounds great, Dad." John said a tear rolled down his cheek. Damn that woman. He thought his parents gave him a comforting hug. "Everything will be all right, son," his mother said. "We'll get through this." A few hours later, the lawyer returned with a notary after signing the documents. John's parents left, promising to call with any updates. They thanked the nurse, who assured them that John was being well cared for and that he would need extensive physical therapy arranged through the VA. John was finally left alone to face the disaster of his life. He rested, but dreamed of his fallen Marines, not Sandra. A few days later, John received a call from his father with some bad news. John told him that Sandra had emptied most of his accounts about 2 months ago. She had withdrawn $854 from his savings. He had the bank statement, which showed that she had taken the money in cash. The only deposits in those 2 months were from his military pay. According to the bank and the teller, Sandra came in a few days after each payday and withdrew everything except for $5. That was just enough to keep the account active. She hadn't opened a new account, so I don't know what she did with the money, but it's okay. Since you have power of attorney, you can remove her name from the account. We don't have any credit cards, so that's not an issue. We'll do that. I also stopped by the house. It's a mess. There's rotten food on the table, dishes piled up in the sink, and it smells terrible. It looks like she took all her clothes and personal belongings, but she left her wedding dress in the photo album. I found her engagement and wedding rings in the bathroom trash. I'm sorry, son. At least the house is still standing. J.N. said, "Yeah." Bob responded, "Your mom is there now, cleaning and airing it out. The bed is a mess and the sheets are stained. If I had to guess, Sandra probably had someone else there." "What do you want to do with the sheets?" "Get rid of them," J.N. said. "Throw them out and burn them if necessary. I'll sleep on a cot if I have to." "All right," Bob said. "Your lawyer, Eric Swagman, has agreed to handle your divorce at no charge. He has a reputation for going after married women. George suggested we change all the locks at your house, and I agree. Are you okay with that?" "Yes, that sounds like a good idea." Dad John replied, "All right, we'll stay in touch." "How are you feeling?" Bob asked. "I'm fine, Dad." "Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself?" Bob asked. John smiled. His father always had a sharp intuition. "Dad, you've lost men in combat," John said. He knew it was a silly question, given his father's service as a second lieutenant with the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel L.B. Chesty Puller in the Korean War. John's father knew all about the sacrifices made in combat and the reality of death. "Yes, son," Bob replied. "I've lost men." John asked, "Dad, have you ever had dreams where they talked to you?" "Oh yes," Bob said. "At first they came almost every night, but they became less frequent over time." John asked, "Have you ever gotten over it?" "You never fully get over it," Bob said. "It becomes part of you. You have to make peace with it and learn to live with it, or it will consume you." The next 2 weeks flew by for John. He heard from his parents daily with updates about Sandra, but never from her. She had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant by him. Everyone in the office knew about their relationship. The divorce process was moving smoothly. John's lawyer, Mick McGregor, was filing the divorce on the grounds of adultery and abandonment. He was also suing Eric for alienation of affection and taking legal action against Sandra's employer for Mick. Said there might be more charges against Swagman based on George's evidence. Bob said Sandra had a meltdown when she found out she was no longer on John's military pay account and couldn't access the money. She also discovered that her house keys no longer worked. Bob and his wife told her to go to her boyfriend for help. John was focusing on his recovery, and trying to find some humor in Sandra's situation. His physical wounds were healing, but he was struggling emotionally. He was mourning his fallen Marines and hurt by the actions of his future ex. John learned to move with crutches and a cane, and the doctors agreed it was time to remove his cast. He was given the all-clear to drive an automatic vehicle back in his room. John saw an orderly hanging up his clean uniforms, now with sergeant's stripes. A doctor explained that he had been promoted and that he would be discharged with physical therapy arranged at a VA facility near his home. John put on his freshly pressed green uniform, grabbed his polished boots and used a wheelchair. John was also given a cane to help him get around the room. He was surprised to see his parents, doctors, nurses, and Lieutenant Colonel Arvin Johnson, his reserve battalion commander. John stood up with the help of his cane and shook Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's hand. The colonel announced John's promotion to sergeant, expressing pride in John's loyalty and skills. He joked, "May God have mercy on your soul," which made everyone laugh. John's parents pinned the new stripes on his uniform. John was really pleased to get the uniform. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson then read out a citation awarding John the Silver Star for his bravery in Vietnam on January, when he was a fire team leader near Da Nang. John had led his team against a lot of enemy forces and kept on fighting even though he was wounded. His leadership and courage had helped a lot in defending Da Nang, and he had shown the highest standards of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson pinned the medal on John. Chess thanked him for his service and said that his experience would be really valuable for training troops. John's mother hugged him with tears in her eyes while Bob wiped away a tear and said he was proud after packing his sea bag. John changed into a Class C uniform, short-sleeved khaki shirt and green pants. He took a wheelchair ride to the lobby where his parents waited for a taxi to the airport. At the airport he was given another wheelchair ride and made an obscene gesture at some long, hair-covered protesters called him a baby killer a few hours later. His parents wheeled him into his house. It no longer felt like a home since Sandra had betrayed him, but he appreciated the privacy. His parents had stocked the fridge with beer and snacks, and his mother had prepared his favorite dishes, including her famous lasagna. He changed into jeans and a t-shirt. He changed into jeans and unpacked his gear from his sea bag. He pulled out a large BO-style knife he had found in Vietnam. The blade was rusty but clean and oiled, with a leather sheath engraved with a winged creature holding a sword and the words marquet or crab. He valued it and promised to look into its origin. He called his lawyer, Mick McGregor, and George to arrange a meeting that afternoon. He checked his truck in the garage, and it seemed to be in good condition. He planned to change the oil and give it a tune-up soon. After inspecting the place, he grabbed a beer and sank into his recliner. His leg was aching, so he relaxed and turned on the TV. He eventually settled on a game show for background noise. He called Wilkins to let him know that he was finally back. Wilkins said, "Brusley, when do you think you'll be able to start working?" John explained the situation with Sandra and what the doctor had said about his physical therapy. "No problem, son. Take all the time you need to sort out your things. Between a brake pad and a carburetor. Sometimes if you can stop by this week, I've got a small welcome back gift for you." "I'll do that, thanks," John said, and ended the call. Mick and George arrived, so John let them in, shook their hands and offered them a beer. They accepted the offer and settled into the living room. "Good to see you back, John," George said. "Your dad told me about your. Well done on getting that medal, you deserved it. Let's get to the point. I have something you need to hear." He pulled out a small real-time audio recorder with a tape already loaded. "Let me set this up for you. I've been following Sandra and Eric from the start. One night I followed them to a steakhouse on the outskirts of town and managed to sit right across from them. I'm not sure if Sandra and Eric were chatting away, but they didn't notice the microphone hidden in the plants between our booths. There'll be some background noise from the waitstaff and so on, but you can clearly hear their conversation." He played the tape and turned up the volume so that Sandra could hear it too. "Have you thought about my proposal?" said a male voice, which John recognized as Eric's. He could almost see the arrogant smile on his face. "I'm not sure," she replied. "Sure, I can do that to John, Eric," Sandra responded. "It's bad enough that I cheated on him and am now expecting your child, but I don't think I can go through with this. Come on, babe, if anyone can do it, it's you. He's probably drowning his sorrows right now. I bet he'd do anything to have you back." Eric said, "You don't know JN that well." Eric's sense of ethics won't let him accept this, There's no Sandra said that he's going to raise the baby as his own and that he definitely won't share me with you. She said that he won't share you and that we won't let him. She said that she doesn't think she's cut out to be a mother and that JN would be a better father than her. She said that she'll make him accept our terms or threaten him with divorce. She said that she'll demand the house, half of his income, alimony, and child support. She said that she's already made plans. Eric said he'd already prepared the paperwork. George stopped the tape, so they really think I'm going to let her stay with him and raise his illegitimate child. JN asked if they were out of their minds. There's more to it, George said, starting the tape again. Eric said he didn't know if JN was going to go for that. Sandra said, "Come on, babe. You know he's so in love with you, or he'd do anything." Eric said, "You're not still in love with him, are you?" "Well, I still like him, but I don't love him like I used to. Besides, you're much better in bed." John's face flushed with anger. "This is what I get for loving that deceitful woman. She wouldn't let me go to Vietnam." "You're right," Sandra said. "When he gets back, I'll talk to him." Eric said, "Do you know when he's coming back?" "No. I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't sent him anything since last year, like you told me." Sandra asked, "I don't want to be involved in that." "Don't worry," Eric said. "I know people who could help with that. You'd be in the clear if something happens to him. You'll get everything and be free of him." "I suppose," Sandra said, "but only as a last resort. We'll see what happens when he gets back." "George stopped the tape," Eric said. "That sounds like..." John said, "I think it's a murder plot." George and Mick nodded in agreement. "It's also a conspiracy to commit fraud and possibly theft, considering Sandra emptied your bank accounts." Mick said, "That's why I filed the court papers on the way here and pushed for a quick hearing. I also got a restraining order that keeps both of them at least 30 minutes away from you, your house and your parents. I've arranged for the papers to be delivered first thing in the morning. I've also spoken with the district attorney, who is preparing a criminal case against them. I spoke with Lee Marcus, the senior partner at their firm, who is a friend of mine. He is furious about what they've done. I told him we plan to sue the firm and mention their involvement in, by the time we're done, Swagman will be lucky if he avoids jail." Mick said, "Your dad and I still have connections in the police department, including the chief." George added, "I've spoken to a few of them and they've agreed to keep an eye on you. Any questions?" "Yeah," said George. "What exactly am I asking for in the divorce?" Mick handed him the folder with all the documents. "I'm sorry, I forgot you were acting on his behalf." Mick said, "Here are the papers. As I mentioned, we're filing for divorce based on adultery and abandonment. Since Sandra has a higher income, there won't be any alimony. You'll keep the house and everything in it because she abandoned it and hasn't paid any of the utilities. We're also demanding she returns $7,000. We're also asking for her to return the money she took from the joint accounts, which was half of the total. She drained both your current and savings accounts and took all the money you'd put in. We're also asking for her to return her rings and change her last name back to her maiden name. She'll keep her clothes and her car. I've asked Lee to keep her employed since she'll need some support during her pregnancy. We know Swagman has just under $1 million, so we're suing him for $800. We're also asking the firm to pay $2 million for failing to enforce their moral clause." Mick said the firm will probably settle for around half of that amount to avoid bad publicity. "One last thing," John Mick added, "do you have a dress uniform?" "Yes," John replied. "I want everyone to see what kind of man Sandra and Eric have wronged. I've got one more surprise for them, but I'll keep that under wraps for now." "That's fine with me." John said, "I'll prepare the uniform. Just let me know when I need to be there. I have a meatloaf and an apple pie waiting for me at home," Mick said. "Take some time to relax," Mick added. John said to be careful. George warned that the neighborhood had gotten a little rougher since the last time you were here. Not as dangerous as the Nong, John thought. "But close," George said. After George and Mick left, John went to his bedroom, changed his shirt, and grabbed his knife, hoping to find a friend who knew how to handle it. He locked up the house, headed to the garage, and started his truck. "Wow, this feels great," he thought as the engine roared to life. He drove to one of his old haunts, stopping to fill up with gas on the way. He parked in front of the bar as he always used to and looked around. George was right, the place looked a bit rougher than a year ago, but John thought, "I've seen much worse." He went inside and headed for the bar through the cigarette smoke. Grabbed a beer and scanned the room, hoping to recognize someone but having no luck. It used to be a place where regular guys like him gathered and talked over a drink, but now it seemed to be he finished his beer and went back to his truck when he heard a woman screaming for help in an alley. He saw a young woman surrounded by 5 or 6 men, and he grabbed his knife from the truck. He approached quietly. One man was tearing at the woman's dress. "Hey, leave the woman alone," John said. The men stopped. They were confused. One man with a switchblade came toward John. John drew his own knife. "You want to play with knives?" John asked. The thug lunged, but John dodged and slashed. He hit the guy in the groin, and the rest of the gang started to back away. 2 men stayed to confront John, but he took one down with a blow to the throat and slashed the other from shoulder to waist. Another man with a piece of wood snuck up behind John and hit him in the face. The attacker fled as the police arrived. An officer approached John and said, "George warned you this area was dangerous." "I guess I'm too stubborn to listen," John replied. The officer surveyed the area and instructed his partner. He called for a couple of ambulances, then grabbed 2 pairs of handcuffs and approached the man on the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. He returned to John and noticed the knife lying beside him. "That's some knife," he said. "Where did you get it?" "I picked it up in Vietnam," John replied. "Let me see it." The officer took the leather sheath and examined it closely. "French Foreign Legion," he said. "Seriously?" "I just got back," John said. "I know you're a Marine, John. I'm talking about the markings on the sheath. The emblem shows it's from the French Foreign Legion. The words underneath mean march or die. This doesn't look like standard issue gear. I bet it belonged to a French soldier at some point." The officer placed the knife back in its sheath and handed it to John. "You should keep this somewhere safe before a tough cop takes it. Maybe frame it or something," he advised John. He nodded. He said, "I will." The woman approached the officer. She said, "Please, don't arrest him, officer. He saved my life. These men were going to do something terrible to me." The officer looked at her torn dress. "It's okay, ma'am. He can go, but you need to see a doctor. We'll need a statement from you. I'll take him to the emergency room in my car. Officer, I'll give my statement at the hospital. Is that okay?" The officer thought for a moment, then agreed. "That's fine, ma'am. You can follow me to the hospital." The second officer quickly approached. He looked at the 3 men in cuffs and whistled. "Wow," he said. "Isn't that Juan Mendoza, the gang leader we've been hearing about?" He was referring to the small man who had attacked John first. The first officer nodded. "Yes, it is," he said. "And this guy took all 3 of them down?" the second officer asked. The first officer nodded again. "Looks like it," he said. "Incredible." By then, 2 ambulances had arrived, and the paramedics were loading the gang members into them. The first officer helped John to his feet. "Have you had enough of this in Vietnam?" he asked with a smile. John laughed, even though it was painful. "I guess not," he said. "All I wanted was a beer with some friends. Well, this lady will take you to the ER. Give me your keys. My partner will drive your truck home, and I'll pick him up after I'm done at the hospital." The officer said, "Stay away from this place. It's gotten dangerous. Drugs, gangs, you know. All the guys are hanging. Out in Redwood on the other side of town these days." "Thanks, officer. I'll keep that in mind," John said. He followed the young woman who introduced herself as Amelia Simons to her car, a small Dodge sedan. On the way to the hospital, she asked, "Aren't you the guy who got a Silver Star in Vietnam?" "Yes," John replied. "How do you know about that?" "Who doesn't know it was all over the news today? Why are you here? Shouldn't you be home with your wife or something?" John couldn't hold back the tears. He began to cry silently, feeling worse knowing that strangers seemed to care more about him than his wife, who he thought loved him. "I'm sorry," Amelia said. "I didn't mean to upset you." John explained the end of his marriage, and Amelia started to cry. She parked in the emergency room lot, found a spot, and hugged him tightly, not caring that her dress was getting stained with his blood. John felt embarrassed by her gesture. "Poor man," she said with tears in her eyes. "That awful woman. You don't deserve that, John." He looked at her, confused. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "Those men were going to do something terrible to me, but you jumped in to help me. You didn't even know me yet, but you risked your life for me." She said, crying, "I'll never be able to repay you for that." John hugged her back. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Yes, I do," she insisted. "I owe you everything." He said, "You put aside your own pain to help me, so I'm going to help you heal. No matter how long it takes, I'll heal your broken heart. I promise you, I swear that no one will hurt you again, Not like she did. You don't even know me, he said. You didn't know me either, she replied. After tonight, though, I know everything I need to know about you. John, you're my hero, my knight in shining armor. I want to take care of you, hold you, and fill the empty space in your heart. Please let me do that for you. John thought about what she said when he looked into her eyes. All he saw was genuine love without any deceit. There was something beautiful about her that he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was because of everything going on with Sandra on his mind. He heard Harker's voice in his head. Go ahead, Corporal. Sorry, Sergeant. He smiled, knowing Alia had no idea why. It's all right, he said, giving her a gentle kiss. Amelia hugged him tightly. You won't regret this, John, she said. They went into the emergency room, where the officer was waiting while the doctor examined John and Amelia. The doctor cleaned the cut on John's cheek and processed the X-ray. The doctor told John that there was nothing broken and that the nail had only scratched his skin. Amelia was also fine. JN told the officer what had happened that night, and the officer seemed to accept it. The officer said that Amelia seemed like a decent person, but she's been through a lot. Her parents died in a car accident a few years ago, and she's been struggling ever since. She has no family and barely gets by as a waitress. I know you have your own problems and don't need more, but it would be great if you could help her. Maybe you two can support each other. Other thanks, JN said. You might be right. He was surprised by what the officer shared. Amelia had never mentioned any of her struggles, but there she was, comforting him. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Perhaps it was love. Whatever it was, it felt much better than anything Sandra had given. The officer gave John a card and said, call me if you need anything. He then turned to Amelia and said, follow me to Junk's house. I need to pick up my partner anyway. Amelia thanked him and they left the emergency room. They drove to John's house in silence. John was thinking about a lot of things, including his soon-to-be ex-wife. His wife had betrayed him. His Marine friends were gone, and now there was Amelia. JN didn't believe in coincidences, but he couldn't help wondering. Both were hurting, but they chose to set aside their own pain to support each other. When they arrived at Jay's house, he invited her in. Come on, Amelia. I don't bite, and it's a lot more comfortable inside than in your car. I don't want to be a burden, she replied. John grabbed one of her bags from the car. Don't worry about that. It's no problem. I have an ex, so there's plenty of room, and it's definitely safer than sleeping in your car, huh? She said. I guess you're right. After setting up Amelia's things in the guest room, John invited her to the living room and offered her a cup of coffee. She accepted and settled on the couch while he made the drinks. They shared their stories with John, explaining everything about themselves. Amelia told John about her parents, who had worked hard but struggled to make ends meet. They lived in an apartment when they died in a car accident, leaving her with nothing but the need to sell everything they owned. There was no inheritance, and the little money she had went toward covering her parents' final expenses. She lost her job as a secretary when her boss moved, and she ended up waiting tables at a small restaurant near the alley where she was attacked. The pay was low, but she managed to get an apartment with a friend. However, her friend got a job in another state, and Amelia couldn't afford the apartment on her own, so she moved in with a guy she'd dated a few times. Unfortunately, he wanted more than she was willing to give, and became abusive. After a few weeks, she left and ended up back in her car trying to save enough to rent a room somewhere. Why don't you stay here? John suggested that she shouldn't take advantage of him. She replied that she couldn't pay him anything and that it wouldn't look good given her divorce situation. John said that she could use the guest bedroom and maybe help out with some chores around the house. If anyone asked about the divorce, he'd just say that she was homeless and that he'd let her stay in exchange for helping out. Amelia was homeless, and I let her stay in exchange for helping out. That sounds fair, Amelia agreed. She just hoped she wouldn't get tired of John. John laughed. Don't worry, he said. I just hope you can handle seeing my face. He pointed to his scarred cheek. She gently touched his scar in his left ear. I can handle it, she said. Actually, I think it makes you look distinguished, like someone who doesn't put up with nonsense. JN laughed again and said, Flattery will get you far. He added that things might get a little busy around here over the next day or two. Sandra and her boyfriend will get the papers tomorrow morning, so I expect a lot of phone calls after 9. I also have some errands to run. Would you like to come with me? Sure, she said. That sounds fun. Besides, I have the next few days off. I'm exhausted, and my leg is starting to hurt, so I'm heading to bed." "Okay," she said. "I'll see you in the morning." "I'll come with you if that's all right," Jan said. "Sure," she said, following him down the hall. "Would it be okay if I slept with you tonight?" "No funny business. I just need someone to hold me." John was already under the covers. She slid in beside him, and he instinctively put his arm around her. She rested her head on his shoulder with her arm across his chest. John thought to himself how nice it felt. They both fell asleep. When they woke up the next morning, Jan was still holding Amelia. "Sorry," John said, smiling at Amelia. "Don't apologize," she replied. "I put your hand there last night because it felt good." She brushed her hand against John's leg, and he smiled back. "I'm glad you're comfortable," he said. They got up, showered, and got ready for the day. Amelia made breakfast while John dressed at 9:20. The phone rang. "What's all this about a divorce?" Sandra yelled. "I don't want a divorce. And what's this about adultery and abandonment? I don't care what you want right now." "Sandra," John said, "you left the house. You refused to pay the bills. You took thousands from our accounts. You slept with Eric Swagman. You moved in with him. And now, you're pregnant, either with his child or someone else's. Is that clear enough for you? I didn't know you were back. John or I would have visited." She said that was nonsense. Jan said angrily, "It was all over the news. Even people who don't know me welcomed me home. But you were too busy with your boyfriend to care about your husband." "You don't. John, I still love you," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. John said, his voice thick with emotion, "I haven't heard from you since last year. I found out everything from my parents when they visited me in the hospital after I was hurt. You didn't even send a card. How can you claim to love me while you're sleeping with that loser?" "But I love you, John," she replied, her voice quivering. She insisted, "No, you don't." John said, "What did you tell that guy when you talked about me raising your child?" "Oh yes, you don't love me anymore, right?" She said, "I'm not like that. Just sign the divorce papers and let's end this. We're done." John said, "I'm going to deal with your boyfriend too." Eric got on the line. "Listen, idiot, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to hit you so hard you'll be begging for mercy. It'll feel like you got run over by a freight train. Check those papers. There's a restraining order against you and Sandra. I know you two plan to burn my house and wreck my truck. If you come near me, I'll put a bullet in your rear. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky if John said, 'We'll see about that.'" Eric responded. Sandra came back on the phone. "John, let's talk about this. We don't need a divorce. Eric and I have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you. Life and stay out." He hung up and punched the wall. "Damn it," he shouted. Amelia approached and hugged him. "It's all right, John. She deserved that, and so did he. Let your lawyer handle this. That's what you're paying him for. Just calm down, okay?" she said. "How can she still claim to love me after everything she's done?" John wondered. "I don't know, John," Amelia replied. "She's not thinking clearly. You and I have errands to run. Let's take care of them and get out of here for a while." "All right, you're right," he said. "What do we need to do today?" "I need to visit my civilian boss, drop off my dress uniform to get it cleaned, and have the medals mounted, then pick up some parts and do a tune-up on the truck." "Let's get started," then she said. "We have a lot to do first. I need to call my lawyer." He was ready to hit something. "I'm curious to see what they propose. I'll be in touch. I'll be meeting with Lee this afternoon to make sure your dress uniform is ready. We're going to court next Friday." "Got it. Thanks, Mike." John said, "I'll drop it off today and call if I hear anything else." They left the house and took John's uniform and medals to the dry cleaner, who was an old World War II veteran and knew exactly what to do. Then they visited old Wilkins. "Hey, boss," Jan said as he and Amelia walked in. Wilkins looked up from his desk, buried in paperwork. "I need a secretary," he said. "I can't keep up with all this paperwork." John glanced at Amelia. "You want to hire a secretary?" he asked seriously. "Absolutely," Wilkins replied. "Look at this mess. I have to answer phones and handle customers at the counter. I know someone who used to be a secretary and might be looking for a better job." "Sure," John suggested. "I'll make an introduction," Wilkins replied. John took Amelia's arm gently and said, "Let me introduce you to my new friend, boss. This is Amelia Simon, who used to be a secretary." Wilkins looked at Amelia and said, "You think you can handle all this, young lady?" Amelia nodded confidently and said, "Absolutely. I can type words per minute, I can take files, and I can handle customers." Wilkins thought for a moment and then asked, "Can you manage the cash register out front?" "Yes, I'm a waitress, but I don't make much," she replied. "Here's what I'll do," Wilkins said. "Give your current boss 2 weeks' notice, then come work for me. Since you're John's friend, I'll start you at a week. How does that sound?" "Yes, sir, thank you, Mr. Wilkins," she said with a smile. "Do you know anything about cars?" he asked. "Not as much as you, but my dad taught me quite a bit," she replied. "Even better," Wilkins said. "Oh, John, I've got something for you." He handed John an envelope. "Consider it a welcome back bonus," he said. John opened the envelope and found a check for $2,000. $340. John shook Wilkins' hand in gratitude. "Thank you, boss. This really means a lot." A week later, Amelia said, "I've never earned that much." "Thank you again, John," she replied. "Don't mention it." "That's almost double what I make as a sergeant in the Corps," he said. "Really?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "Do you really know about cars?" "Yes," she said. "We didn't have much money, so my dad taught me how to fix things. I learned to do tune-ups, change belts and tires, and even change the oil. Don't let Wilkins hear that. He'll have you working on cars all the time." John joked. Amelia laughed. "I don't mind getting my hands dirty with grease. Just get what you need for the truck and I'll show you." Jayan smiled. "Wow, I think I'm falling in love with you." "You," he said. Amelia laughed and gave him a kiss on the cheek. "I think I'm falling for you too," she said. They stopped by John's bank where he deposited the check, putting 10% into savings as usual. He withdrew $100 for expenses and ordered new checks without Sandra's name. Then they went to an auto parts store. After grabbing a burger, they went to buy everything John needed for the truck. They then went home. Jayan thought about how the place felt like home again with Amelia around. He pulled the truck into the garage and got everything ready while Amelia went inside to change. She came back wearing old jeans and a t-shirt. John asked Amelia, "What should we do?" Amelia grabbed the spark plugs and wires. "I'll handle the spark plugs and wires and you can take care of the oil change," she said. "Sounds good," John replied. "Do you know how to gap the spark plugs?" she asked. "No, I don't," John admitted. "I'll show you," she said, without waiting for an answer. She grabbed the tools she needed and got to work. John was surprised at how skillfully she used them. He grabbed the tools he needed and started changing the oil. By the time he finished, she had replaced the spark plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. He inspected her work and was impressed. It all looked perfect. But appearances can be deceiving, so he lowered the truck and started the engine. The truck roared to life. He lightly revved the engine and listened for any issues. He was happy with how things had gone, so he turned off the engine and looked at Amelia. She had grease on her hands and face. She looked more beautiful to him than ever. "So, how did I do?" she asked. John took her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "I'm definitely in love," he said. "You're a mess," she replied, smiling. She didn't care about the extra grease on her face. He handed her some hand cleaner. He gave her some hand cleaner and thought back to a time when he'd wished Sandra would enjoy moments like this with him, but she'd always thought his work was too dirty. After cleaning up, Amelia cooked dinner, and they enjoyed a quiet evening watching TV. John felt more relaxed than he had in a long time, and for once he made it through the night without thinking about his soon-to-be ex. Over the next few days, John was kept busy. He picked up his dress uniform from the cleaner and spent hours removing loose thread, heads, and polished his brass shoes and hat. Amelia gave her 2 weeks' notice at the restaurant where she worked. They informed her that her employment was terminated immediately and told her to return in a few days to pick up her final check. During those days, John and Amelia grew closer and decided to hold off on advancing their relationship until John's divorce was finalized. The finalization of the divorce was a challenge for J.N., as it had been a long time since he had been with a woman. However, he was truly falling in love with Amelia, and it seemed she felt the same about him. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. John showered, shaved, and dressed in his uniform after breakfast. He walked into the living room where Amelia was waiting in a beautiful floral dress. She said, "Wow," admiring him in his dress uniform adorned with medals. "You look fantastic," he replied, smiling. "Thanks, but I feel like Christmas tree," he replied. "You look incredible too." At the courthouse, they were greeted by 14 Marines from John's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts. After introductions, they entered the courtroom. The Marines filled 2 rows as John walked to the table where Mike was waiting. John's parents also joined the Marines. John glanced at Sandra and Eric at the opposite table. Sandra's eyes widened when she saw the man she had betrayed. Though he looked impressive in his, she was shocked to see his missing ear and the scars on his face. Eric smiled while stroking Sandra's belly. Sandra hadn't yet noticed Amelia. The judge entered the courtroom and asked everyone to rise. Once everyone was seated, the judge addressed the Marines. "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" he asked. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson stood up. "Your Honor, my Marines and I are here to show our support for Sergeant Harris and if necessary to speak on his character," he said. The judge thanked Colonel Johnson and said that he didn't think it would be necessary, but he appreciated the support. The Marines remained silent, but Stern looked at Sandra Swagman throughout the hearing, which proceeded just as Mike had described. The judge asked both parties a series of questions about their marriage history and the reasons behind John's divorce request. Sandra admitted to leaving the house, neglecting to pay the bills, and becoming pregnant by Swagman. Then he tried to convince the judge to order child support. The judge asked, "Do you seriously expect me to make Mr. Harris pay child support for a child you fathered? Are you serious or are you simply not thinking clearly?" He was denied throughout the hearing. The judge rejected all of Swagman's motions and requests. In the end, the judge ruled in Jay's favor, granting him everything he had asked for: the house, a permanent restraining order, and no child support payments. Sandra was also ordered to return half. The judge said she should return the money she had taken from their joint account and revert to her maiden name. She didn't need to return her rings since she had already discarded them. Swagman protested, but the judge silenced him with his gavel. Mr. Swagman," the judge said, pointing his gavel at him, "I'm ordering an investigation into your involvement in this case. At best, there is a significant conflict of interest, and I know the district attorney is investigating other possible illegal activities, including conspiracy. I also understand there's a lawsuit against you for alienation of affection. Your actions and responses today will be considered in that matter." The judge slammed the gavel down on his desk. He looked at John and then at the Marines in the courtroom, who were glaring at him and Sandra with hostility. Sandra lowered her head in shame. Lee, who had been watching from the back of the courtroom, approached Swagman after his outburst. "You're fired," Lee said. "I'm also filing a complaint with the Bar Association. Pack your things and leave my office by the end of the day. We'll take another look at your performance." Lee then shook John's hand. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant. On behalf of the firm and the board, I apologize for what you've been through. Given the situation and considering Mr. Harris's service, the board accepts your initial offer. We don't see the need for further hearings. Please schedule a meeting with me next week to finalize everything." Mike nodded as he and Lee shook hands. "Thanks, Lee. I'll call on you." On Monday, Mike said. Lee smiled. "Maybe now I can win some of my money back on the golf course," Lee said as he left. Amelia approached John and hugged him. John hugged her back and noticed that Sandra was watching him through her tears as the embrace ended. Sandra spoke up. "John, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Well, you did," John replied. "I just want to know one thing, why?" "I don't know," Sandra said. "You were away. Eric was around and maybe I started thinking about the money. I got tired of being broke. One thing led to another and, well, you know the rest." "What were you and Eric talking about?" John asked. "Eric, I thought you'd be okay with raising my child while I stayed with him." She said at first, "I didn't like the idea, but then it started to grow on me again." "I'm sorry." John shook his head. "I see you didn't waste any time replacing me," Sandra said, looking at Amelia. Amelia stepped in front of John, ready to face Sandra. "I'm not here just to replace you," Amelia said. "I'm here to heal the heart of a good man, the heart you broke, and I plan to spend the rest of my life doing that." Sandra lowered her gaze before replying, "I suppose I deserve that. John, do you think we could ever be friends again?" "I'm not sure," Sandra replied. "You hurt me deeply. If it weren't for Amelia and my family, I might not even be here now." "I didn't know that," John said as Sandra turned and left the courtroom. John shook Mike's hand as they prepared to leave. Marines and John's parents had gathered around them. "Thanks for everything, Mike. I really owe you," John said. Mike waved it off. "Hey, that's what friends and family are for, right?" he said. "Besides, I've always wanted to see that jerk put in his place. I'll contact you next week after I've talked to Lee. You're in for a big payday now. Go celebrate. You've earned it." After shaking hands with the Marines and gathering their things, Mike left. "Good job, Sergeant Colonel Johnson," he said, shaking John's hand. The Marines also shook his hand and wished him well after they left. John's parents hugged him and said, "We're so proud of you, son." John introduced Amelia with pride, and his parents embraced her warmly, as if she were part of the family. "You need to bring her over for dinner sometime," John said to his mother. "I plan to do that a lot from now on," Jan replied. Sandra's pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and she was told she would not be able to have more children. The firm kept her on a contract that said she couldn't have any kind of relationship with other staff members. She worked there for 20 years and was still single, sometimes babysitting John and Amelia's kids. Tragically, she died in a car accident. John, Amelia, and his parents went to her funeral. Eric Swagman lost most of his money fighting legal battles he lost in court and all appeals with the Bar Association. The district attorney didn't press charges because there wasn't enough evidence. One night after leaving a bar, he was attacked by masked men and suffered severe injuries. A sign was hung around his neck, and weeks later he was found hanged. J.N. proposed to Amelia on the day his divorce was finalized. They married in a traditional Marine sword ceremony. They continued working for old Wilkins until he passed away in 1980, leaving the shop to John. John stayed in the reserves, retiring as a sergeant major in 1992. A year after Desert Storm, he occasionally had dreams about Vietnam, but managed them well. John and Amelia ran the shop until they retired in 2008, when they passed it on to their 2 sons. 10 years later, while window shopping, John saw a drawing of the rose tattoo he had almost gotten in Vietnam. He decided to get Amelia's name tattooed over his heart. "What are you doing?" Amelia asked. John explained, "I want your name right here over my heart where it belongs. You promised to heal my heart all those years ago, and you did. Now I want everyone to know how much I love you." Amelia's eyes filled with, "You don't need to do that," she said. "Oh yes I do," John replied. "I owe you everything," she said, sitting down. She knew that once John made up his mind, nothing could change it. "Are you sure you want to do this, Grandpa?" the tattoo artist asked. "Yes," John replied, taking off his shirt. "All right," the artist replied. "Is it going to hurt?" "Yes," John said. "It's going to hurt a lot, but it's worth it for me," Amelia said. She smiled and wiped away her tears as she watched the artist tattoo her name on John's skin.